Welcome. My name is Beri Meric. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you today to Gary, Hamel, and Michele Zanini. Gary and Michele, welcome. How are you guys today?
Thanks, Beri. A pleasure.
Yeah. Hi, Mary. Good to be here.
Yeah, so good to have you both. We have a truly amazing conversation coming up, and I'm incredibly excited for it. To give everyone a little bit of context, we're going to be talking about how we can all create organizations as amazing as the people inside them. So our whole mission with our community is to help everyone unlock their best potential. And to do that, there's no other way but to help others that we work with, that we interact with, to unlock their own potential. And Gary and Michele have literally dedicated their lives to figuring out how we can best do this. So if we truly engage with them and ask them the right questions, I do believe that this conversation can have a life-changing impact on ourselves and everyone we care for, both at work and in our lives. And they're truly the ultimate guides for this conversation. So Gary was hailed by the Wall Street Journal as one of the world's most influential business thinkers. Michele is a globally renowned management consultant. Together, they co-founded the Management Lab, which is an organization that builds technology and tools to support breakthrough management innovation. And together, they also very recently launched their new book called Humanocracy, which was already named one of the best 16 books of the year in 2020 by Inc. magazine. So our conversation today is going to have three parts. First, we're going to learn for about 20 minutes. Then we're going to get 20 minutes of action items. And finally, 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. So everybody participating live, I'm going to do my best to ask great questions. And we all depend on you to really challenge Gary and Michele to then challenge us in turn on how we can take ourselves and our teams to the next level. So once again, Gary and Michele, welcome. To kick us off, I want to ask you, why did you decide to focus your efforts on writing your latest work, Humanocracy? There's thousands of management and leadership and organizational behavior books out there. What did you feel was the gap? And what do you think is truly at stake here if people actually follow your suggestions and guidance versus if they fail to do so? What do we have to gain and what do we have to lose?
Well, I'm happy to start, Beri, on that. And I'll speak personally. I think there were two things, kind of a macro and a micro thing that led me at least into this interest. First of all, like Michele, I've spent a lot of my life working with organizations around the world. And I have to say, here and there was some success, creating billions of dollars of market value and getting innovation out the door. And yet so often after a year or two, having put a project team together, done something amazing, you come back and you found that the organization had reverted to type, that anything we had tried to do had kind of just dissipated. And then as we look deeper, we could see that organizations around the world were struggling with the same disabilities. I don't care what industry, what country, but on average, they were inertial. It usually took a crisis to provoke real change. They were incremental. They struggled with game-changing innovation, and they were dispiriting. And so it just seemed like we have these incredibly important organizations that we depend on as a society, but in some profound ways, they were continuing to disappoint us in ways that were common, which tells you this is not about one industry, one company, one CEO. There's something deep and almost genetic that is impairing the ability of our organizations to intercept the future. So that was kind of the top-down perspective. The more bottom-up perspective was seeing this data, which I'd seen maybe 20 years ago, but unfortunately hasn't got any better, looking at the data on the engagement of people at work and recognizing that around the world, only 17% of people are truly engaged in their job, looking at this data that says only 1 in 5 believes their opinions matter at work, and recognizing that, and again, we won't take all the data here, but recognizing that most organizations waste more human capacity than they use. And that seemed to us, so at one level you have this competitive macroeconomic problem of organizations that can't change as fast as the world itself. And then you have the micro problem of human beings that are not allowed and not able and not encouraged to bring the best of themselves to work. And that seemed to us an extraordinary waste with profound economic consequences. And so that is really the problem that we're trying to tackle here.
Yeah. And I would just build on what Gary mentioned by saying that my personal aspiration was to, really catalyze finally the future of, of organization that people have been talking about for the last 50, 60 years. Because one of the things that struck us as we were doing kind of the research for this book is that people have been bitching about bureaucracy for a long time. People have anticipated its demise because of technology, the fact that people are not going to put up with authoritarian tendencies and control from the top and so on. But yet, despite these predictions being kind of teed up every generation, and despite the fact that some of the, there are examples of alternatives, we just don't seem to make much progress. I worked at McKinsey for over a decade, and I remember when I joined, there were people talking about the future of work, the corporation of the future, and that was like in the kind of the late 90s. They were talking about the corporation of the future. 20 years later, you could take their prescriptions, and they would be cutting edge today. Right? I mean, literally, you just, cut and paste, change the date, and they look like, completely novel thinking. And we're like, let's, at least I was very determined to find ways of breaking the cycle. And as we'll get to, Beri, in this conversation, it's really about being really serious and understand the economic and personal consequences of the status quo, right? Number one. Two, really getting an understanding of what an alternative model might be and the principles underlying this. And third, most importantly, I think, is finding charting a path from here to there. Like how can you make this happen? Because some of these organizations that we profile, some of them are novel kind of discoveries. Some of them have been around for a long time. And yet we don't seem to kind of learn. And so that's at least what really drove me, and I think Gary as well.
Excellent. Thank you both. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, right? Every organizational leader wants their people to perform their best and be their best. They have just every incentive is aligned, and every individual contributor typically wants to have a fulfilling, meaningful impact. Yet something seems to be breaking down. That 17% engagement rate at work is a scary one. And clearly there's huge economic consequences, as both Gary and Michele stated. So now that you've shared this high level motivation you have for making this happen, can you also just anchor us in time? You already mentioned, Michele, that, since the 90s, we've been talking about the organization of the future. Tell us, though, what have been the most recent critical trends in the run-up to the pandemic in terms of how organizations were looking to address these, and what do you believe will be accelerated by the pandemic, and what will be decelerated? What can we expect right around the corner when it comes to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, the trends that we've seen over the last few years have changed very little at all. And my baseline case would be that COVID changes very little that's truly important. As Michele was mentioning, or at least alluding to, there have been 60 or 70 years of organizational innovation. And, with you go back to T groups and to high performance work teams, to total quality management, all the way up to more recent things like mindfulness and agile teams. And there's no evidence that these things change really much of anything. The things that have come in the past, every few years, something new is heralded. We all have these great expectations. It's going to crack kind of the bureaucratic ice, and then it fails to do so. And I think, part of that reason is we keep grafting new practices onto old bureaucratic rootstock. And we don't go back and change the DNA. So it's a little bit like putting a tutu on a dog and hoping you'll get a ballerina, just like it doesn't work. And then we're kind of disappointed. And I think we kind of see the same thing now. There's this great hope that somehow remote working is going to, shift the organization. And clearly, in a crisis, as we've seen with COVID, power moves out to the periphery. Newly empowered teams, or people kind of wake up, they dust off their initiative, they realize the center doesn't have a plan, that this crisis is too big to wait for somebody else, so they start to act. But if you look at other crises, there's a very familiar pattern here. As the crisis kind of passes, the center reasserts its authority, power is sucked back up from the periphery of the organization. And remote working may change something, but people have been working remotely for now quite a long time. And if you talk to those people, they will tell you that working at home in an age when we're all technologically tethered to work, working at home doesn't free you from oversight. Working at home doesn't turn poopy work into good work. It doesn't invert the pyramid. It doesn't give you more decision-making autonomy. It doesn't make your organization feel like a community. So I mean, I think for sure COVID is a nudge. And I do think thoughtful and reflective leaders are going to say, yeah, honestly, it's not only COVID. It's COVID, it's climate change, it's ethnic strife, It's a world that's changing faster than ever before. And so they see this as maybe the latest and sternest test of organizational resilience. But unless we take this opportunity and are very proactive and thoughtful about it, we will revert to type, because we've been doing that for decades. And obviously part of our conversation today is, okay, what happens at last? What do we have to do to break that old model? But hoping that any particular outside force will send bureaucracy into retreat, I think the evidence says that's a rather naive hope.
Thanks so much, Gary. I'm really excited for us to dive into the key findings in your latest work. Before we do that, though, I'd love for both of you to just, kind of put up a mirror so that we can see what mistakes we might be making and what could be most critical for us to solve with the guidance that you give. So could you share with us, if you just had to narrow it down to the fewest number of items, what are the biggest mistakes that organizations make when it comes to this topic time and again? And what are also maybe the biggest myths that organizational leaders believe in that keeps causing these mistakes to happen on a recurring basis?
Okay. Well, let me start, Beri, and then Gary, I'm sure you can add a few more. But one, and Gary alluded to this earlier, it's being, scratching just the mere surface of the problem and trying to find surface level solutions. So, going through an agile transformation project that doesn't really change the power dynamics or the real management processes that, that drive how the organization makes decisions and operates, and just limiting yourself to, doing stand-up, weekly stand-ups or daily stand-ups and calling managers scrum masters, things like that, label changes, and, kind of someone has called it like agility theater or innovation theater. Those kinds of things, are super easy to implement and may show like a leader gets it, to the organization or to investors, at least in the near term, but then, they typically fall flat because, they're not very deep and they won't last, and people will be disenchanted until the new idea comes across. So that'd be one, just focus, and we'll get to this later, but you really focus on values and principles as opposed to practices. That's, one of the things that you ought to do and which typically isn't done. So that'd be number one. Number two is, making change happen. And the typical way that happens in organizations is from the top down, right? So the CEO comes down from Mount Sinai with the tablets. Here's how we're going to change our organization. We're going to do Holacracy, or we're going to do X, Y, or Z, and everybody's going to get on the program. And often those kinds of changes that are brought, specified from the top and shoved down, the throat of people down in the organization don't go very far. They're not particularly effective. They engender a lot of resistance because people are, don't like to have things done to them. And so just thinking about creating a new way of changing that is much more exploratory, experimental, and kind of bottom up is important. So that'll be number two. And then Gary, maybe you have some other ones you want to add to that list.
Yeah, I think I might talk about three things very quickly. If you ask Beri, like, what has held us back? And we'll again, we're going to go deeper on this, but let me give a few things. I think one, I would just start with perspective. The deep belief at the core of bureaucracy, and let's be clear that every medium, small, large organization pretty much around the world is still run by those old bureaucratic principles. Power trickles down, big leaders appoint little leaders. We wedge people into specific roles. Everyone's competing for promotion. Managers assign tasks, assess performance. So it doesn't matter your size. We're all pretty much running that kind of same model. But at the core of it, when you get below the practices, there's a very essential perspective there. And unless you change this, nothing else changes. In the old bureaucratic model, we see human beings as instruments. So if you think about it, the model is the institution, the organization hires people to produce products, services, and profits. And so in that model, the human being is an instrument. In fact, we talk about them as human resources. Like what an awful term that is, or human capital. I mean, we should just never talk that way. And so we see them as resources. And I can tell you, when you treat people like instruments, you will never get the best out of them. One of the signal things in my learning was sitting a decade ago across the table in my California office from Zhang Rumin, the pioneering chairman and CEO of Haier, a Chinese appliance maker. And he said, Gary, we want to treat every employee as their own CEO because human beings are an end and not a means. Right? How many CEOs or leaders start out with the categorical imperative and think about human beings in that way. So we're trying to flip it around with Humanocracy is to say, no, you start with the individual. People join organizations because it allows them to multiply their individual capabilities and make an impact collectively they couldn't do individually. So the organization is the instrument, not people. So unless you've made that mind flip, anything else you do is really probably not going to be effective. So that's the perspective. The second thing I would talk about is persistence. Making these kinds of changes takes a long time. If you look at the vanguard companies we talk about in the book, many of them have been on this journey for a decade or 2 or 40 or even 60 years. And so, if you think about the challenge of remaking that old model and building something in its place, of in a sense, retooling every management system, process, structure, that is not something you do now. You can make enormous progress quickly. You can see financial and competitive results quickly, but it is a journey you are on for a long time. So if you come in as a leader and your objective is like, let me make a quick difference, let me spike the share price by financial engineering, share buybacks, doing a deal, you're never going to have the patience to really stick with this. So I would say number 2 is persistence. The last thing which Michele kind of mentioned is power. Bureaucracy is a massive multiplayer game. It's played for the stakes of positional power. And if you've spent a decade or 2 or 3 learning how to accumulate and use positional power, learning how to hoard resources, manage up, negotiate targets, defend your turf, when somebody comes and says, hey, we're going to turn you from manager to mentor, that's a pretty difficult thing to struggle with. Hire in its transition, it redeployed 12,000 middle managers. Those jobs just don't exist anymore. Burzorg, a Dutch home health organization we talk about in the book, they manage 16,000 healthcare professionals with 2 managers. So unless you're willing to say, the nature of what I do as a manager or supervisor, this may change radically, that I have to think incredibly differently about how I build and use my own influence and power, unless you're willing to take on that challenge as an individual, bureaucracy will persist. Because in the end, bureaucracy doesn't advance absent human intention. It's, we're all part of that. We're all playing that game. And until some of us say, we're done, we're walking off the playing field, the game probably doesn't change.
Excellent. So my key takeaways from what you both shared, one is just like staying too surface level, just doing label changes and stuff like that, which also then Gary called just persistence, just knowing that these are deep changes that need to take time. The power dynamics. So if we don't fundamentally change people playing the game of bureaucracy, then they're going to get stuck in this. And then finally, it's all about that perspective. I think Gary, your point about flipping it such that the people are not the instruments, but the organization is an instrument to unlock those people's potential to make an impact. Without changing that, obviously, then we're going to be stuck in a paradigm where everyone is being treated as an end, as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. So thank you both so much. Now, exactly 20 minutes into our conversations, I want to switch gears and really dive into the key learnings from your latest book, Humanocracy. So first of all, share with us the definition. What is a humanocracy? How does it differ from a bureaucracy or any other way of organizing? And before we dive into them in depth, if you could give us a bird's eye view of the key kind of framework you've developed, the key areas that we can take action on to create a humanocracy. And then from there, we'll dive into each one in turn to get your suggested action items.
Well, let me try to give a very simple definition, a very compact, and then Michele can maybe elaborate on this a little bit and talk about some of the key distinctions we see between kind of companies in these 2 different models. So the simplest level, and I think we have to define kind of bureaucracy by the alternative, or humanocracy by the alternative. So bureaucracy is essentially a set of systems, structures, and processes that are designed to maximize compliance. So that's what was invented to do. 150 years ago, most employees were poorly educated, if not illiterate. Information was very expensive to move. The easiest way to do that was to build a pyramid, 10 people to report up. That person would consolidate all that information, report up again. So that traditional hierarchy was simply an information processing tool. Change was rather gradual, and scale was the most important advantage. None of those things are true anymore. And yet we still have, have this model that's basically built to maximize compliance. And that was the primary job of managers, was doing that. Humanocracy, by contrast, is built to maximize contribution, not compliance. And so the question it asks is not how do we get everybody doing the same thing, but it asks, you know, what kind of system and work environment, system processes would we need that would elicit and deserve the very best that people can bring to work. So that's the simplest definition. Something built for compliance, something built to maximize contribution.
Yeah.
Thank
And,
you.
and if you look at the companies that exhibit this kind of worldview, right, that design their organizations and treat people through the lens of humanocracy, you'd see very different practices from bureaucracy. Let me just maybe call out a few distinctions, Beri. So in a bureaucracy, power is vested in positions, right? There's a hierarchy with, you know, specific roles and responsibilities and, you know, and power relationships as a result of that. In a humanocracy, you still have a pyramid, perhaps, but it's one that is based on influence and it's earned, right? And it's peer attested. So, big bosses don't appoint small bosses. If there are leaders, it's, you know, those are appointed by the led, right? And it's based on their ability and contribution. In a bureaucracy, strategy, as Gary mentioned earlier, is set at the very top, and it's a very cloistered kind of calendar-driven exercise. In a humanocracy, strategy is an open, you know, firm-wide conversation that involves all kinds of voices and is dynamic. It's always going on. In a bureaucracy, resources are allocated, you know, by you know, very much like the Soviet Union, right? So it's administrative fiat. You know, it's the budgeting committee that decides how many, you know, dollars different units get. In a humanocracy, resources are allocated through market-like mechanisms, and they flow to the opportunities, you know, spontaneously flow to opportunities that deserve more resources. You know, individuals compete for promotion in a bureaucracy. Individuals compete to add value in a humanocracy. You know, compensation correlates with rank. In a bureaucracy, compensation correlates with impact in a humanocracy. You know, and you know, in a bureaucracy, employees have a little financial upside. In a bureaucracy, in a humanocracy, they have significant upside. They have the ability to feel and act like owner, right? And there are many more of these little distinctions between these two in the book, Bear, but that should hopefully give you and the audience a little bit of a practical sense for how these two models differ.
Yeah, let me build just on that last point Michele said, which may be, you know, beyond that high level perspective of compliance versus contribution is maybe the most important thing. You know, and let me just frame this for a moment. In a survey that was done in May by Harris in the United States, only 29% of Americans said they think that capitalism currently works for the average American. In a global survey, 56%, more than half of people globally, said capitalism now does more harm than good. And, you know, we would take a contrary perspective, not to argue that we don't need longer term investors, we don't need more vigorous antitrust, all of these things, but we would take a slightly different perspective and say the real problem is that actually we don't have enough capitalists. We have millions upon millions of people who see themselves only as employees, but who do not see themselves as entrepreneurs. And we bought into what I think is a desperately wrong perspective that you cannot build a deeply entrepreneurial culture in a large organization. And so right now, and we lay out this data in the book, right now in the United States, and we see this pattern around the world, there are more people, a greater percentage of workers in the United States are working in companies with more than 10,000 employees than work in companies with less than 50. The rate of new business creation is going down in the United States. And so we have this myth that like it's these young little companies that are entrepreneurial, but I can tell you, they're not enough of them to make a real difference to our economy, to productivity or anything else. And so what we see in the companies that we profile in the book, companies like Svenska Handelsbanken and Nucor and Haier, what we see is the ability to turn employees into entrepreneurs, or if you like, micropreneurs at every level, by dividing the organization into smaller pieces, by giving everybody a genuine P&L, by giving them the autonomy to make important business decisions, by giving them a genuine financial upside in their business. And so really creating organizations, large organizations that feel like a league of owners. So if I just said one thing that in practice distinguishes a humanocracy from a bureaucracy, is human beings at work will tell you, this is my business, I drive success, I profit from that success. In a bureaucracy, this is somebody else's business, and I'm here to do what they tell me.
Excellent. I think the contrast is very clear. And I think all of us listening here can see elements of where we go more bureaucratic than humanocratic, although I'm sure that many of us at small companies do see sparks of what you're talking about, giving people ownership. But the key challenge is, how do we make this a systemic change so that more businesses can embrace these methods? So what I want to do now is really dive in here to organize a lot of the suggestions you already shared in a way that will be more actionable for us, so that we know kind of how to start dealing with this. So I know that you've come up with this model with five M's of like, what are the different things that companies can do. What I'd like you to do is to share what those are at a high level, but then specifically frame it in a way that really challenges us to take a particular action. Now, before we go ahead, I do recognize that every company is different, and we were talking about that before we went live. But in general, like, what are the activities you challenge us to undertake, or questions you would challenge us to ask in each of these areas you've identified, so that we can start on this journey towards transforming to more of an humanocracy and leave the bureaucratic ways behind?
So, Michele, why don't you kick us off there, and we'll just go back and forth, and on each one we'll literally try to keep it to just a couple of minutes of like why is this important, and then what do you do?
Mm-hmm. All right. So the first M is motivation, right? So we all can bitch about bureaucracy and so on, but it just remains very much a conversation for the water cooler, as opposed to something you really meaningfully try to defeat, unless you get really crisp around the costs of bureaucracy. And the fact that it does contribute to overhead. That's probably the least, the best known kind of issues with bureaucracy. In fact, you have lots of people in management and administrative functions that may be may not be necessary, right, to drive the business. So there's overhead. There's also but also there are things, problems, downsides of bureaucracy that are harder to measure. So how do you measure the fact that you're not as resilient as a company, or you're not as innovative, right? There's no like line in the P&L that says, your innovation score is X, right? And you need to do better. So we think that, having metrics that measure the drag of bureaucracy is really, really important. We have a tool called the Bureaucratic Mass Index, or BMI, that we prototyped with 10,000 readers of Harvard Business Review, that at least gets you going in understanding, what are the biggest sources of drag in the company, and what might we do to overcome this. And you can benchmark your results against this panel that we've created. So we have an instrument actually that's going to go up on our humanocracy.com website very soon, and that it's also detailed in the book. So that will be the first one. And by the way, as Gary mentioned, it's not just about the practical cost of bureaucracy and the economic cost of bureaucracy, although that's pretty significant within a company and for the entire economy when you generalize across, but also there's a human cost, right? We also, are pretty adamant about the fact that you need to build a moral case. There's a moral cost of bureaucracy. People deserve to be free, and we don't take that as a controversial issue when it comes to, the way you live your life in general. But when you come at work, it's okay to be tyrannized, right? And we don't think it is, right? Because you just lose so much. And so you gotta both be very mindful of the practical, economic kind of cost, productivity cost of bureaucracy, as well as the moral cost. So that would be the first M.
I think the second is new
before
models.
we move on, sorry, Gary,
Yeah.
just before we move on, because I want to make sure, so you have this BMI index that we can do the survey, and I guess like the body mass index, you probably want it to be lower rather than higher. But just specifically when you talk about this, like, build a moral case, I think for many of us, like, all the intentions are there, but like actually doing that is difficult. So what would you suggest? Like, should people, like a business leader, have a conversation about the fact that they want to do this? Like, do you have a team? Like, how do you integrate it into a company? In a nutshell, what are some critical things you can do to like get everyone on the same page that you're embarking on this journey, above and beyond getting the metrics to know where you lie in the index?
Well, I think the measures are desperately important because, managers and others, we pay attention to things we can measure. And often the costs of a problem go unrecognized until somebody goes to the trouble to dimensionalize it, which is what we did. And this costs, excessive bureaucracy costs the U.S. economy more than $3 trillion a year. And if we could fix that over the next decade, we would double the productivity rate in the United States, which drives lifestyles, it drives income. So there's a huge economic reason to do this. But to your second question of, how do you build the moral case? You stand up and say, this is wrong. Like, this is not about a conversation. This is not about some technique or tactic. You just say, this is unconscionable. How is it that somebody in their private life can buy a car or a house, and at work they cannot buy a $300 office chair without somebody's permission? And so, Thomas Paine, the great revolutionary thinker back in the 18th century, he said a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. So I think you just stand up and say, no, this is, and when you look back through human history, the most powerful argument for changing deeply embedded social structures was the argument that every human being has the right to grow and develop their gifts and to profit thereby. And the things that we put in the way of that are iniquitous. So I don't know, what would you add, Michele? But I just think you stand up and say, no.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, all the companies that we outlined in the book, they're very different. I mean, they come from different industries, different business models, different countries, and so very different practices in some respects. But what they're unified by is this very deeply held perspective that, started with the founder of the company in many cases. Sometimes it came a little bit later, but everybody shares, which is that, human beings, they're the drivers of value and they have inherent worth. And so we need to create an organization that leverages that systematically, right? And so you really have to get woke about that. And then you need to have the courage, and we'll maybe get into the final M, Beri. I don't want to spoil the final M, but we do have some practical advice for how do you do that? How do you catalyze a conversation about this with everyone in, whether it's your team, whether it's your department or the entire enterprise. So, but yeah, you just basically have to stand up and get going wherever you sit.
Got it. So, okay, we put the stake in the ground, we make clear this is our intention, and then of course people want to see action. So what's the second step in the model with the M's to get us there?
Well, I think the second M is around models. And I think, one of the things that often holds us hostage is we don't have an alternate model. We haven't seen it, anything very different. And so, I'd ask the people, watching and listening to us, go back 20 or 25 years and ask, how easy would it have been for you to imagine a YouTube with 31 million channels? How easy would it have been to imagine a self-driving, affordable electric vehicle, right? It's often hard to, it's hard to look beyond what is to what could be. And that's particularly true with bureaucracy. Why do all these young companies that grow up with radically new business models, why by the time they reach a couple hundred employees, they start layering in bureaucracy? Because they start hiring other experienced managers and leaders, and they bring that with them. So, pretty much every organization we've been inside and around in our lives fits that same template. So you have to make a commitment to really going out and finding things that look very, very different from your own organization. And, today we've gotten used to the idea of radical business model innovation. We can see this with Airbnb and other things that look nothing like the incumbents. But you at least have to start to ask yourself the questions, could the future of management or could tomorrow's organizations look literally almost nothing like the ones that we're working in today? And so what we've done in the book is we've assembled a decade's worth of work and research in what we think are the most progressive organizations of the world and the ones that are most radically different from the ones that we have now that are running, that have thrown out the bureaucratic playbook. So make a personal commitment to digging in those and learning from them and understanding not just what are they doing, but how do they get there? What do you have to believe about human beings or success or the nature of work to end up with a management model that's so radically different from what's familiar to us?
If you had to name 3 companies that are like really great role models based on your research, what are the 3 companies you would name?
Hire. Michele and I wrote an article about this for the Harvard Business Review a couple of years back. It's a chapter in the book. 80,000 people, a couple of management layers, divided the entire organization into 4,000 micro enterprises, no powerful staff groups, units contract, so hire with each other. Hire would be number one. I would say number two, Morningstar, 500 people, largest tomato processor in the United States, scale intensive, process intensive, kind of quotes ordinary employees, and they're running a large organization without a single manager at all. And probably number three, healthcare, Birdzorg in the Netherlands. We mentioned that earlier, delivering a critical service with better patient outcomes, with greater productivity, with enormous engagement, and doing it with literally nothing that looks like the sort of elaborate organization structures and processes that are familiar to most of us. So there's more, but I maybe start there. Michele, you might add others. I don't know, but those are good ones.
Yeah, well, obviously this is just us talking about the book with a very biased perspective, but one of the things I'm particularly proud about in the book is that we have examples of companies that, aren't necessarily faded. They're not like Silicon Valley darlings like Airbnb and, or the secrets of Google. I mean, we do have an example of Google, but it's a very small one. These are, companies that work in, low margins, in some cases, low margin, really competitive industries with a workforce that isn't necessarily college educated. We have examples from Southwest Airlines, which is the most profitable airline in the world, well, in the US, and it's still probably the least unprofitable airline in the US, even today with COVID. Nucor is another example we feature in the book. They're the largest steel maker in the United States, 26,000 people. They're the most innovative company in the industry, most profitable as well. Their employees are paid higher than average in the industry. They're the engines of innovation. They are, as I said, incredibly technically proficient, and they come up with all sorts of breakthroughs, yet they don't have a CTO. They don't have a chief technology officer. They don't have a big staff function that, calls the shots on like where to go and what technologies to develop. It's all kind of emerging in a very structured and collaborative way from the bottom up in a way that really harnesses the collective genius. And so, those are, some other companies that, they've been around for a long time. They have been hailed as progressive companies, but I think they've, the thing that is very impressive about them is that they're very, very large. And these cultures, these kind of humanocratic cultures have endured for decades, under different leaders, which shows that these aren't just flashes in the pan. You can create an incredibly successful and long-lasting institution based on these kinds of values and ideas.
And Beri, I just add one thing to that. The organizations that we profile in the book, they are all immensely more productive than their peers, immensely more profitable. We talk about Svenska Handelsbank, and by far the world's most decentralized bank. They've beaten their European peers on return on equity every year for 49 years in a row. So it's not like you have to worry about, well, do these companies really win? Yeah, they win like hell, and they beat everybody else. And so, I have to add one more thing though. It's not only about going out and looking for new models. It's to stop looking at the old ones. I would say to your listeners, if you pick up a business book and you realize that in the first chapter, the author of that book still believes the best way to organize is like a hierarchy. When they talk about leaders, they mean people who have positional power. If they talk about the leadership team and they mean the top people run, just like put the book down. There's literally nothing there to learn. Go on and find something that's newer and has a better perspective. Just like start to cleanse your mind of all of those assumptions that we've had for the last 100 years about how we organize people at work.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. So let's take a maximum 5 minutes to go through the remaining 3 M's, and then we're going to dive into the audience questions, which are really great. For everybody listening live, this is your opportunity. If in the next 5 minutes, you can get your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to do a quick 1-minute Q&A with the audience right after this. So if you would, please, Gary and Michele, the remaining 3 M's without any interruptions from me, and then we'll dive into the audience Q&A.
Okay.
Go ahead, Michele.
Well, I think we can cut it down to 2 more M's, maybe cut, migration and mindsets. I don't know, Gary, if you agree. But maybe I'll do mindsets because Gary talked about ridding yourself from bureaucratic assumptions. I'll do that quickly. As we mentioned in the book, to change the organization, you need to change yourself first, right? So you need to own your part to kind of, perpetuating bureaucracy and take some corrective action. And, we kind of borrow from Alcoholics Anonymous and one of their steps in the 12 steps program, which is, a fearless moral inventory. And we think that, that's something that you can do to yourself and just ask yourself, how are my behaviors, reinforcing bureaucracy? How has bureaucracy made an asshole out of me, right? And how do I change that? So we have a set of questions in the book that you can kind of benchmark yourself against over, the last week or month, and then maybe you get your colleagues to give you feedback. But it's things like, did I subtly undermine a rival? In a bureaucracy, power is very much a zero-sum game, right? So, it's tempting when you move ahead to discount the contributions of others or sow doubt on their integrity. So like, have I done that? And if so, what triggered it? And what can I do to prevent that from happening again? So that's one question you might ask. Another question might be, did I just fake enthusiasm for, one ideas that my supervisor came up with, right? So, often, not supporting your boss's ideas is a career limiting move, right? But if you really want to be, detox yourself from bureaucracy, you have to be able to say, no, your idea is not good, and here's why, and let's come up with a different solution. So pushing yourself to be less compliant and less blindly obedient. Or, did I play it safe when I should have been bold? The penalties for screwing up in a bureaucracy are very, very large, right? And so people might be very risk averse, but there may be situations where you might want to be able to, take a bit of a risk, or let your team take a risk on behalf of the entire, unit. And so it's through that kind of, moral inventory, as we say, or self-reflection, that you can start to see, where maybe your behavior is falling short of the aspiration to become a humanocrat, right? And it's kind of something that, we've seen done very effectively, especially if it becomes part of your routine. So that's mindset.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank
on the
you.
last one, migration, the big challenge is when you look at some of these, the post-bureaucratic vanguard, they are so different in every respect that it can be extraordinarily daunting to say, like, how in the world do you go from here to there, particularly if you don't have a lot of positional power. And as Michele was mentioning earlier, the traditional change model is broken. I mean, one thing that every large consulting company agrees with is that 75% of change programs don't meet their objectives. And that's when we're trying to do like relatively easy things. So one thing we would say for sure is you cannot wait for the bureaucrats to uninstall bureaucracy, right? That's not going to happen. And by definition, when you're trying to do something that's new, difficult, and unprecedented, no top-down change program is going to work. And so what we've been doing, and it really is a two-part answer, but what we've been trying to do is encourage people to start where you are, right? The way we change large, complex systems is not some high-level engineering where we work out the whole new system and all its permutations, almost detail, and then we implement it. Instead, it's a process of experimentation. You look at how different life on the web is, or let's say e-commerce in general from old bricks and mortar commerce. That didn't start with just one company saying there's a new model. There's hundreds, thousands of experiments being done on the web, and over time, this thing changes. So the way we think we're going to beat bureaucracy is not in one kind of Armageddon-like battle, but when every single individual says, how do I take these principles, the principles of humanocracy, openness, experimentation, ownership, community, meritocracy, if I took that principle serious in my team, what do we do that's different? And then thinking about how do I run that as an experiment? And I really do need, despite the limitation of time, to give you one example so people have a sense of what does it mean to hack the old management model. So one example we talk about in the book was a team that was really frustrated by their company's travel policies. And you had to get somebody's permission to travel on business. They had all these rules about which airline and so on. So they ran a little experiment where for a month, they took a small group of people and they said, you can travel anytime you like, no permissions, no audits afterwards. We still need to see some receipts, but like we're just going to take that whole travel bureaucracy, poof, it's gone. By the way, when you come back though, we're going to publish all of the costs of your trip online where everyone can see it. So of course, what happens is travel costs go down. There was a measurable improvement in engagement because people say I'm not being infantilized anymore. But they did that with one experiment in one small part of the company for 30 days. And I will tell you, just like most of us can't imagine an alternative to bureaucracy, we can't imagine a way of changing large, complicated things, one brilliant hack at a time. But today, if you look at in the world of software, all of the most important software in the world today is based on open source. Every single bit of it that now runs our computers, our smartphones, Android, the web, all starts as open source. That was like hackers who said, I'm not going to wait for Microsoft to do the next thing. I'm not going to wait. I'm going to start right where I am writing code. So largely what we do in the book in the last few chapters is give some immensely practical, almost like hour by hour instruction on how do you build your hack? How do you test it within your organization? But then just as importantly, how do you propagate that? How do you build a community? You know, one of the primary mistakes people make low down in an organization is when they want to try something new, they ask permission. Like, don't do that. Like, don't go up. Just like, don't do that. Go sideways. See if you can find a dozen people who will help you build that hack, who will help you test it. But don't wait for somebody else to give you permission. So when we stop thinking about ourselves as employees, and at every level we think about ourselves as activists, and when we give ourselves permission to change the system wherever we are, then something will start to change. Yeah. And then when you connect those people through with social technologies, and you get a lot of voices, then nothing can stand in your way. You can change very large, complicated systems from the bottom up if you think like an activist and you leverage social technology.
Yeah. Beri, I know we're going to go to Q&A, but maybe 30 seconds on this. I'm just still mystified at the fact that, you know, people understand now, thankfully, finally, that they can innovate the business model and they do prototypes of products and services. But somehow when it comes to the management model, like an HR practice or strategy process or whatever, oh, no, we can't touch that. You know, it doesn't come from God, you know, like you can actually change it. And there are things you can do in your little part of the organization so that you don't even have to, as Gary said, you don't have to go up to the CHRO or the CEO to get permissions. Because if we wait for that, we'll wait a very long time.
You know, the companies that win, without doubt, the companies that win over the next decade and beyond, the organization that win, will be those that evolve their management models faster than their peers in ways that make their organizations more resilient, more daring, and more innovative. And the only way that evolution is going to happen is through experimentation. It's just the way it has to be.
Excellent. Love it. Thank you so much, both of you. It's very empowering, the approach you're taking to like have it be bottoms up, collaborate with your team, have everybody have the opportunity to create this humanocracy alongside you, no matter where you are in the chain. So thank you very much. We've got about 8 questions and we've got about 9 minutes left before I give you the final 2 minutes to wrap up. So let's spend 1 minute per question to the best that you can. I'm going to kick off with Gunjan Doshi's question, who asks, are there any practical suggestions that we can do in the next 90 days to start the journey?
Sure. Go ahead, Michele.
Well, I'm assuming that most of the audience has some sort of managerial responsibility. And so if that's the case, I would say that you got, you know, beyond doing the inventory, you know, the bureaucratic detox that I mentioned, you know, going through the inventory. The other thing is to start giving some power away, you know, and you know, if there are meetings in your department, instead of going yourself, you know, have a member of your team go on your behalf to represent you, and have that person, you know, be fully empowered. So they're not just there to occupy your seat, right? They can speak on behalf of you and the team. That'd be one. Or, you know, get the team to spend a day, you know, thinking about, okay, how do we rethink our job descriptions individually and collectively? You know, do that as an exercise, reset, you know, what people do and get into a dialogue about what people want to do and how they might work with other people. And, you know, again, make that a conversation that the team is driving, not you kind of writing up the script for them. And the last one might be, you know, have the team think about setting the mission or the goals, you know, for the team, for the department, and, you know, have them take a first crack at that. And then, you know, have a dialogue about it. So I think in the book, we have, I think, 21 distinct ideas for how you might be able to start to syndicate your power to others. But that would be something that you can do literally like tomorrow if you wanted to.
And I think the other thing that's very easy to do is get your team together for a half day or a day. And literally, we lay out almost hour by hour kind of timeline on this in the book. But get them together for a day and start by asking, what is it in our organization that most frustrates our capacity to do the right thing for the customer or to get the best out of people? What system, what process, what behaviors? And then ask yourself, all right, given that, what principle that we talk about in the book, building stronger sense of community, more ownership and freedom, more of a meritocracy, what principle do you think would help us overcome that? and then try to think, how would we operationalize that principle? You know, we share a little story in the team of, or in the book, of a team that was frustrated, that was so difficult to get new ideas funded in their organization. And they were inspired by sites like Kickstarter. So they literally, they took a small team, gave everybody $150. They put up a big whiteboard on the wall, and they said, for the next couple of weeks, if you have an idea, put it up on the wall, just like write it out, literally stick it to the wall. If you want to fund it as one of the peers, go up and put your funding commitment on that wall. Let's test this idea of crowdfunding with a few $100 with a few weeks. Well, it was very successful. That idea propagates. The organization today has built and runs a very successful company-wide innovation platform. But that was something that says, we're not going to wait. I'm not going to go to IT and ask them for help. I'm like, let's run an experiment here right now, and then we'll see what happens. And you know, it's very easy for higher ups, for leaders, to say no to one person that comes with a crazy idea. It's very hard to say no to a dozen people who've actually built something, tried something, and come back and say, we want to scale up. That's hard to say no to.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. That was excellent. Next question is from Mitesh Lakhani, who asks, from an execution standpoint, we have KPIs for each role and each department as a true, and each department to have a P&L is not always possible. If teams are given independent authority over their KPIs, how else can we add the concepts of humanocracy into our organization?
Well, I have to disagree. I think every single unit can have a P&L. There's no reason that can't happen. If you go look at the deep story we tell about hire, every single internal service provider, HR, IT, R&D, every one of those has been divided into small micro enterprises. They call them nodes, typically with only 10 or 12 people in a node. All of those internal service providers, like Smart Manufacturing, they sell their services to other micro enterprises inside of hire. There are no internal monopolies. And so every single little service unit has been divided into a P&L. If nobody wants to buy your services, you go bankrupt. And so yeah, when you know, we tell the story in the book of Jim Hagemann Schnabe, who is a co-CEO at SAP, now at Siemens and Maersk. And he talks about at SAP them having 50,000 KPIs. Like, that's rubbish. That's the idea that somehow from the center we can deconstruct success into hundreds of individual targets, push them down, and that will aggregate back up to success. No, it doesn't happen. You have to divide the organization into smaller units. People need new P&Ls. Every single employee needs a large share of their compensation that is at risk depending on the job they do for internal or external customers. If you don't do that, I don't know how it's possible to get beyond that.
Thanks so much, Gary. Definitely powerful and challenging at the same time. And thank you for providing us with that kind of North Star to aim towards. Next question is from Talal Baya, who asks, can you speak about some examples of failed transitions to humanocracies and why they failed?
Well, I mean, there are, let me pick one, which is a fairly old one, but I think it's pretty typical. So there was this company called General Foods, you know, a food packaging and food product company in the US. It was quite large in the 60s and the 70s. They where some people there working there were really taken by this principle of, you know, a human-centric organization. So they created a whole plant in Topeka, Kansas, that was based on these principles. So, you know, they redesigned it from scratch to show that this could work, right? So they had teams that were highly collaborative, you know, shared target setting, shared compensation, shared decision-making, all of that. And it worked really well. And it was, you know, the most productive plant, I think, of the General Foods in the kind of enterprise. And then, you know, the person that kind of put this together there, you know, left, right? And eventually it was replaced by another manager who thought this was like all communist kind of BS. You know, this is like in the 70s, and said, okay, we gotta kind of take this all out. And it didn't, you know, that, you know, the system was actually well embedded, so it wasn't like the person didn't nuke the entire management model right away. But over the next several, you know, years, it ended up whittling itself down to basically nothing, right? So, and the lesson I take from this is the following, right? That, you know, they started with a part of the organization that was quite isolated. So it was very vulnerable, right, to being reversed if the wrong, you know, if a different leader, you know, showed up as the person did. And it wasn't something that was truly embraced. You know, it was something done by someone at the periphery. And, you know, unless you, you know, you might start, you know, at the periphery with an experiment, but unless you really embrace this shift at a deep level, it's always going to be vulnerable to things like that. And this movie we've seen play out, you know, decade after decade as companies, you know, start and then stop.
You know, one of the successful examples of transformation, at least it's still early stage, that we share in the book is Michelin, the French tire company. And it really did start with just one or two people who were quite passionate, Beri, about making this change. But what they did was quite interesting. There was no top-down program. There was no like, here's the new model and we're going to roll it out. And we're going to put people through all the sheep dip and the training and whatever else. What they did instead is they went across all their factories globally and they found 38 first-level supervisors who were willing to be part of an unscripted year-long experiment with no check-ins, with no like, how are you, just like, are you willing to give away your power? Are you willing to stick at it despite adversity? And they let them run for months before they tried to consolidate any of the learning. And of course, what you find in that is when you start 38 distributed experiments, nobody can stop that. Like there's no place to go and say, like, don't do it. And when it's not some big sanctioned program with a label on it and nobody can go, you can't even find like where would I go to stop this? And now it's spread from these teams to plants, from plants to corporate functions. And now I think it's become an unstoppable movement with Michelin. But exactly as Michele said, it wasn't something you could, and I should say, it's not, I think, entirely by accident that the leader of this thing was ex-military, had been in French army. And he realized when you have a force that is distributed and passionate and unorthodox, it's very hard for conventional army to fight it. So that was their change process.
Excellent. That was great. Thank you both so much. We've got only a minute or two remaining. So what I'd love to do is, to help us wrap up, I'd love to ask you, what are the best ways in which our community can best engage with your work, support your work, spread the message? How can we best support you and engage with you? And if you have a final piece of wisdom or a call to action you want to leave us with to wrap up, that would also be great.
Okay. Well, I would like to, so thank you. We really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to do this, Beri. I would point the audience to a course that Gary and I put together called Hack My Org. It's something that is free for those who buy the book, and it's all geared towards equipping people with the skills and the tools to become internal activists and try to bring about humanocracy in their organization. I'm sharing here the screen. If you go to hackmyorg.humanocracy.com, you'll be able to go there and you can check out the preview of the course and get in. But we have about 4 hours of video lectures, interviews with progressive thought leaders and activists, and then a bunch of tools so you can start lighting the fire over your organization and make the journey towards humanocracy. So that's what I would shamelessly plug here for your audience, thinking that it might actually be helpful to them.
Yeah, I would, certainly on my website, GaryHamel.com, there's a lot of content. It's all free. The course, I think, I think people find it extraordinarily useful, extraordinarily empowering. But I guess my simple advice would be don't be Dilbert, right? Don't assume that you're helpless. And it's been so frustrating to me for years in my profession to go to all these conferences where you have CEOs talk about the extraordinary things they've done, and people sit there and go like, well, I'm not the CEO. Or you have like management experts tell people, how do you be more effective in your job, your team, your leadership, whatever. But what you never hear is, how do you change the damn system when you don't own the system? And yet that's what we need today. And that's what we try to lay out in the book is, how do you punch way above your weight? How do you change things that nobody ever asked you to change and you don't have permission to change? Because, it's ironic that every CEO says the world's changing faster, we need to change faster. Very few organizations have taught people to be activists, not terrorists, not anarchists, to be activists. So the Hack My Org is how you become an activist and how you make the sort of difference that you can make and how you build the sort of organization that you'd want to work in.
Excellent. I love it because I mean, so many of us in our leadership positions believe so deeply in entrepreneurship, taking initiative, and being accountable. Yet we don't necessarily create the environment for others in our organization to do that. And today was such an incredible call to action to remind us to like close that disconnect. Like if you really believe in entrepreneurship and people stepping up, then let them and get out of their way and give them the environment. And I think you two did a great job of helping reignite that within us. So thank you both so much. Wishing you the very best and can't wait to meet you in person soon.
Thank you, Beri.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
to your listeners.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care and see you again soon. Take care, Gary and
Thank
Michele.
you.
Bye-bye.